Hey everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Rethinking Youth Pressure and Possibility. My name is Melissa Simpson. I'm Next City's Audience Engagement Editor, and again, I'm happy to have you all here. Today we'll be talking with Michaela Leslie Rule and Jennifer Wallace, authors of How We See Us, Young People Imagining a Path to Their Futures and Never Enough. Um, Before we get started and I go over the presenter's bios, I just want to do a couple housekeeping notes. First, if you have any questions for our speakers, please make sure to submit them to the Q&A box, and Jennifer will do her best to get to your questions towards the end of the webinar. Additionally, feel free to say hi in the chat. I know a couple folks are doing that already. I welcome you to, say your name, say hi, what city you're tuning in from, and also maybe if you're open to it, where you work and the kind of work that you do. Additionally, at probably tomorrow or the middle of next week, we'll have a recording of this webinar up on our website at nextcity.org/webinars. And in a few minutes, I'll go ahead and drop the links to both Michaela and Jennifer's books. But let me go ahead and jump into their bios before I pass it off to Michaela. Michaela Leslie Rowe is the author of the book How We See Us, Young People Imagining a Path to Their Futures, published by Harvard Education Press, which explores how young people think and feel about education, work, and careers. She's a researcher, artist, and cultural strategist who has spent more than 2 decades advancing racial and gender justice through the power of narrative. As a senior program officer at the Gates Foundation, Michaela designs and invests in narrative strategies to improve students' math experiences and learning outcomes. Before working in philanthropy, she designed and led audience research, theater, film, and narrative change projects that span the the United States, Europe, and East and Central Africa. Jennifer Wallace is an award-winning journalist and author of the New York Times bestselling book, Never Enough: When Achievement and Culture Becomes Toxic and What We Can Do About It. This book was also named the Amazon Bestseller Book of the Year. Wallace has contributed to the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. After graduating from Harvard, Jennifer began her journalism career in television at 60 Minutes. Now I'm going to hand it off to Michaela, and you can also check the chat for links to where you can purchase both of their books.
Hi, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm going to share my screen. It's going to take me just a second, and then we'll be off. So first, I just want to thank Melissa Simpson and Next City for setting up this conversation and for allowing me to be here today. Obviously, hats off to Jennifer Wallace for agreeing to be in conversation to talk about her work and to kind of field and help with some of these questions that I'm hopeful you all will have. And then also to all of you who I think have shared and cleared your schedules a couple of times for this, once last month, and we had some technical difficulties. And so I really appreciate you being here again today. So Melissa sort of shared a pretty good summary of where I come from in my work. I think the only thing I would add to that is that as a researcher, I've done different types of work connected to young people and their experience. And that has included conducting research as a young person myself with my peers and engaging in participatory action research, later on facilitating some work that was, more akin to participatory research with young people, and then doing research like this for projects that informed how we see us. So, what now feels like long ago, pre pandemic, I found myself in the midst of a 2-year research project that was really intended to understand how young people understand and experience their occupational identity development. So, what does that mean? It's what they're interested in, it's what they feel like they're good at, and it's where they feel like they belong. And in these conversations, what we heard from young people is that they were really describing their lives, their aspirations, their hopes, and their dreams, right? And they were talking about the challenges that they felt might stand in the way of them getting from where they were now to where they wanted to be. And also talking about what types of supports they might need, what they felt like would help them along the way. And they described these things with like a really deep richness and power. And so it was in listening to young people that kind of transformed the way that myself and my colleagues related to the work and what we sort of thought about what was the most important pieces to lift up and to share more broadly. And in particular, I think it started to challenge our own perceptions of the types of narratives that many in our field, whether that be youth development or research or philanthropy, right? Many of us in these helping fields, it started to challenge some of the narratives that we bring to young people of color, in particular Black and Hispanic young people and young people from lower income communities. So with that, I thought the best way to start this short talk would be to introduce you to one of the young people who participated in this research. And his name has obviously been changed, and we've changed some of the identifying characteristics, but for the purpose of this, we'll call him Xavier, right? And this is a pathway image. This is an image that came from the research. We would call it a research asset. It's something that young people who participated in focus groups filled out during these conversations. And we talked about it, or we presented it as a game of life. So the idea was that they would place themselves at one place on this pathway, anywhere that they wanted, and then write a dream or a goal at the other end, right? And then in these segments in between, they would fill in the steps, stages, opportunities, experiences, people that they thought they might need to have or to meet to make it from where they were now to where they wanted to go. And so Xavier's pathway starts at the top. He's currently working at GameStop, and he's doing tournaments. You can see that there's some little annotations to help with the handwriting so that you can take a look at it, and feel free to kind of zoom in. But he's working at GameStop, and his goal is to become a professional gamer. And here are some of the types of information that we often would accompany, right? An image like this in traditional research. He's a Black male. He's 19. He's not currently enrolled in post-secondary education. He completed his GED. He's from a lower income background. He lives in New York City, and he lives with friends. And so I want you to just take in that information about him, and I want you to just think for yourself, what might you imagine about Xavier's experience so far? Like, what's the likelihood of him becoming a professional gamer? And just enter that into the chat. Just what are you observing? What are some of your thoughts or assumptions or wonderings, right, about Xavier? So as you're sort of thinking about this and typing into the chat a little bit, right? I want you to think about this idea of narrative, right? So narratives are these deeply held beliefs that we bring into our sense making about anything, right? About issues, about conversations we have, about people that we meet, right? And they really inform not just our perception of what we're experiencing, right? Or what in this case Xavier is experiencing, but it also really informs our perceptions of power, right? Who has power, who needs power, who has the power to change things, right? In this case, I would say agency. So when I was thinking about this idea of narrative and thinking about some of the things that we bring, these beliefs that we bring to some of these stories about young people, I started to notice that there was kind of this narrative misalignment, is what I would call it, right? There was kind of a misalignment between how young people saw themselves and made meaning of the experiences that they were having, right? And what I would say is a persistent dominant crisis narrative about young people of color in particular, but Black and Hispanic young people and young people from lower income communities even more so, right? And that crisis narrative is one that kind of demands that we as helpers help, that it kind of validates who we are and why we do our work, right? It often implies that young people need to be fixed or that their communities need to be fixed, that they need to be pulled out of the environments in which they live and work and grow, right? And somehow either put into a new environment, right? Or something needs to be changed dramatically around their surroundings in order for them to thrive. So I wanted to kind of interrogate that. The other part is that there's a disconnect, right? We know why some of these crisis narratives are like in the water, right? It motivates people, it motivates folks to take action, and can be a really good thing, right? They also exist because we know a lot about the outcomes for young people who, for example, don't attend some type of post-secondary education, right? Or young people who are not living with their families, right? And are choosing instead, as Xavier did, to live with friends. We know a lot at kind of the population demographic level about the potential outcomes, right, for young people. But there's a question in there for me, which is when young people themselves don't see themselves in crisis, that they don't describe their experiences in crisis. And we, as the adults that are creating this narrative environment or have a large hand to play in creating a narrative environment around young people, are labeling their experiences as crisis experiences, what does this disconnect do, right? And how might we interrogate some of the reasons why we wield these crisis narratives, and what might it look like for us to disrupt narratives and replace them, right, in some ways, with stories that are more reflective of how young people see themselves. So, what does that require? It requires listening, right? We need to listen to young people, right? And one way that we can listen is through research. And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how, within the context of the focus groups in particular, because we were able to create these spaces where young people were in conversation with one another, we were able to hear perhaps some things that we wouldn't hear otherwise. Um, so, what did we hear? We heard a little bit about the notion of surviving, striving, and thriving, which became a kind of a meta framework for the work that we do, and became a meta framework for understanding young people's relationships to education and career. And we also kind of arrived at this idea of 5 occupational pathways, which comes back to the image that I just showed you of Xavier, that pathway image. We started to really think about, are we asking young people really the right questions, right? Is it really about what they want to be when they grow up, right? Or is it potentially about how they want to feel, right? What do they want to feel as they enter adulthood and move through adulthood? And I think importantly, what do they already know? So I wanted to give you kind of a high level, I feel like, orientation to these 2 of these frameworks, because I think of them as tools in some ways, right? Tools for listening differently and listening more deeply. And this one, the surviving, striving, and thriving framework, is really one of the first things that jumped out to us as researchers. And with the help of a cognitive linguist who kind of looks at metaphors within how young people speak or how anyone speaks, we arrived at this notion that work is really perceived as a journey. So young people are experiencing work as both kind of a noun, like it's the thing that I do, and also as a journey, right? It's this road that I'm on. So that's one, this work as a journey metaphor. The other piece is that young people have an understanding of the emotional states that they assign to different periods of their lives, which correspond to experiences of work. So job, kind of like this job idea, is that you're kind of in the survival mode. It's this experience for many young people they're having at that moment between 15 and 21 of not having a lot of control, working a lot of jobs to survive or to make ends meet. They talk about renting and not owning in terms of housing and apartments. They talk about having a lower quality of home in some cases, and for some of them, relying on food stamps or stamps or relying on some type of government assistance. And so this is not necessarily purely their own experience of working, but it's informed by what they see around them, right? There's this notion that there's a feeling of survival mode that they don't want to experience as they age. And then I'm going to skip striving for the moment and talk about thriving. And this notion of thriving is characterized, interestingly, really similarly across many different young people, regardless of their, educational background, their race, their gender, the part of the country that they live in. They talk about thriving in pretty similar terms, right? They talk about this sense of control. You can see that that's in contrast to surviving. They talk about ownership of businesses, ownership of homes. They talk about travel, the freedom to travel, not having any debt, the notion of giving back or being a leader in one's community, and the ability to retire, which I think also speaks to this reality, right? They're very much aware in some cases of what's happening in the world and what's happening in their communities and their homes, and that informs their notion of what thriving might look like. And then the last thing is the striving piece. And I think this is interesting because I'm going to make an assumption and say that many of the people that maybe are on this call and this webinar, and a lot of the people that I meet that work in this space of pathways, education, and career are really focused on striving, right? On what does it look like to make steps towards your future life. And what's interesting about this is that most of the young people we spoke to have a really clear sense of what the emotional experience will feel like to kind of working hard, perseverance. They talk about feeling struggle as a good thing, having patience. They're going to overcome their obstacles, right? And for some of them, attain more education or particular credentials. But when you talk about what they need to do to engage in those experiences, it's harder for them to articulate. So in my mind, that potentially is a really interesting place to dig in. Is if we are acknowledging what they want to feel in this thriving state and what they've already experienced, how do we help them to better understand and articulate what goes on in that struggle, patience, perseverance state? So the second thing that I wanted to share in terms of frameworks is this notion of the pathway, and this is what I started with, Xavier's pathway, right? And I talked about the game of life. This is the image that they were given before they filled it out on the right-hand side, and that they filled in to reflect their own understanding of their journey towards adulthood, basically. So a lot of our work is focused on what young people need, right? We're often focused on the knowledge, the skills, the opportunities that they need, and that's important. But this framework is really focused on what do they know, right? What would our work look like if we focused on what they know about themselves, what they know about the world, right? What they imagine about the world, and how what they know influences and impacts the journeys that they map out for themselves. So this 5 occupational pathways, right? It's kind of it's 5 categories that I implore you not to use in a prescriptive way, right? It's more about how we listen, not how we categorize. Um, but the first is really around knowing what they want to do and knowing how to get there. And I'll be curious when I ask you to look at Xavier's image again, where you might place him in terms of these ideas, right? The second is not sure what they want to do, but have a good idea of the steps to get there. The third is knowing what they want to do, but they're unsure about how to get there, right? So in some cases, we saw pathway images where there was a very clear idea of the goal, like I want to live in a house. I want to live in a wooden house, for example. I want to live in a wood house. I want to have steps up to my house for kids that were living in environments where there were a lot of double wides, for example. So maybe that was what was incredibly well fleshed out at the end. But the steps to get there were almost completely empty. There was a lot of confusion about where do they enter, where do they get on, kind of the on ramp to the pathway. For others, there was kind of, they're just not sure. They're not sure in any way. I'm not sure what I want to do. I'm not sure what steps I want to take, right? And you can imagine that the entry point for a young person who's in that number 4 sort of type of pathway, that the entry point might be very different than for a young person who sees themselves in number 1 or number 2. And then finally, they know what they want to do. They think they know how to get there, but their imagined pathway is inaccurate or unrealistic. And I'm keeping that in this framework, even at this space in my own analysis and my own thinking and my own kind of transformation about how I see this work, because I think in some cases it's true. In some cases, the steps are not quite accurate, right? I hesitate as I say that because I feel like we too often group kids in that number 5, right? We disregard their dreams. We kind of we act as if what they want for themselves is trivial, right? That they can't possibly know about enough about the world or themselves to make good decisions. And so I want to be kind of cautious. I want to give you a bit of caution around that group number 5. So if you think about these 5 pathways and you think about the notion of surviving, striving, and thriving, I want you to now look at Xavier's pathway again, right? And on the right, I've included a quote that gives a little bit more color and context to Xavier's story, which he shared in the context of the focus groups. And he says, I think the only person that inspired me to actually pursue what I wanted to do is my ex-roommate. I started living with him. He pushed me to actually get better at what I was doing, gaming. He was like, why don't you just turn it into your career if you love it so much, right? Okay, so when we think back about this idea, surviving, striving, and thriving, surviving. Interestingly enough, Xavier talks about working at GameStop, the choice to work at GameStop, as an example of his agency, right? He talks about the choice to remain in proximity to this thing that he loves and he's excited about. He gets cut rates at discount rates at games that he wants to play. He's able to attend tournaments and participate in tournaments, right? So he's made a clear decision to remain proximate and to continue to grow in something that he enjoys. He's got this idea of instructional steps, which I didn't talk that much about. I didn't talk about, but we kind of thought, okay, well, within these ideas of what the different segments look like and the steps look like, there are instructional, relational, and emotional steps. Instructional steps are more what we would think about into like getting credentials, right? Something that has to do with instruction. Relational steps are around building relationships with the people around you, networking, social capital, and emotional steps are about working on self, right? I need to be more patient, I need to be more outgoing, etc. So Xavier has several instructional steps. He has this progression in his job to becoming a manager or a senior game associate. He has this element of coaching. He wants to become a manager of gaming, right? He wants to become a manager of a game team, and so he talks about the coaching that he'll need to get there. He has relational steps that are very clear. He's building relationships at home in his personal life. This friend who is essentially acting as a mentor in some ways around his chosen career. He has chosen family for some complicated reasons that he describes. He's chosen a family outside of his home that supports his dreams. And again, this proximity to gaming and gaming culture. The striving piece, he actually is able to articulate this. He's going to competitions, he's practicing, he has a value around working hard and has integrated that into the steps that he's taking for himself. And he has this notion of thriving. And in his version of thriving, ownership is around team ownership, right? He wants to pay it forward. He wants to teach other people to love and enjoy this thing that he enjoys and to get better. And he wants to have more control over his life. So I show you this because I wanted to really drive home the notion that there are many different ways of hearing and engaging with the same story. And hopefully this is one that you'll be able to kind of take with you or to consider as you engage with young people's stories yourself. So the last thing I'll say here is when we think about the beginning and the idea of a crisis narrative and this misalignment, I think there are a lot of things that we can do to get closer to narrative alignment. We can design with young people's lived experiences at the center, which I think many of you are already committed to doing. I think we have to acknowledge the steps that young people have already taken towards their future goals, rather than this idea that they are what do we say? That they're starting from nothing, right? And they just need to be they're subjects or objects of our interventions or our ideas. And I think we need to really share and amplify more honest stories about how we all set and reach our goals, and really try to help young people to see the ways in which we as adults have iterated on our goals and our desires and our dreams many, many times, and how our destination evolves. So I'm going to leave you with that. I'm going to pass you off to Jennifer. I've got a couple of minutes over, but hopefully that doesn't mess us up too much. And Jennifer is going to talk to you about what she's learned about young people before we go into Q&A.
Oh, thank you so much for that. So we're going to make a real shift for a moment. And I'm going to tell you about the research I conducted for my first book, Never Enough, which came out in 2023. It's a different population of kids. It is a book that came out of an article I wrote for the Washington Post in 2019, which was covering two national policy reports. One was the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the other was the National Academies of Sciences. And so these are two reports written by our country's leading child development experts. And they were looking at who are the young people who are most at risk today. And they named, as you would imagine, children living in poverty, children with incarcerated parents, the children of recent immigrants with few resources, children living in foster care. And then for the first time, they named a new at-risk group, children attending what the researchers were calling high achieving schools. These are public and private schools around the country that are generally well-resourced, where the kids most often go off to four-year colleges. What the researchers were finding was that these high-achieving students were now 2 to 6 times more likely to suffer from clinical levels of anxiety and depression, and 2 to 3 times more likely to suffer from substance abuse disorder than the average American teen. And this was because of what the researchers were calling an excessive pressure to achieve. Childhood today, I don't have to tell everyone on this Zoom, is very different. And I was looking at why is childhood today so different for these high achieving kids, right? Who have such resources. They're in well-resourced schools. They might not stem from, the top 25% of household incomes, but they are given every opportunity. So how is it that they are struggling more than their middle-class peers, and in some cases with rates as high as children living with in poverty, which is a shocking thing to say. And I remember saying this to one of the researchers in that report. How can I cover this story? I remember her saying to her, how can I cover a story about high achieving kids who have every resource available to them? And she snapped back at me and she said, no one is putting pain on a scale. Pain is pain, and a child doesn't get to choose their circumstances. So fast forward in my research, I went in search of the young people today who were doing well, despite pressures in their environment. I wanted to know what they had in common. And it boiled down to this idea of mattering, that the young people who were doing well today felt like they mattered for who they were deep at their core, and were equally depended on and relied on to add value back to the world. Mattering is not my idea. It's an idea that's been studied since the 1980s, but it's been sort of locked away in academia. Mattering matters throughout the lifespan. Mattering matters, to every background. It is, to link it to Michaela's research on narrative, it is mattering is the story we tell ourselves about our place in the world. Sociologist Gregory Elliott describes it as mattering is, do people value and appreciate me, or do I go unnoticed? Do I truly belong, or am I moving through this world alone? Does my life make a difference to others, or would it not matter if I weren't here? So just to give you a little bit more background on mattering. So it was through Never Enough that I discovered this concept of mattering. And of course, mattering matters for all of us. Researchers who study it argue that after the drive for food and shelter, it is the need to matter that drives human behaviors for better or for worse. So when we feel like we matter, we show up to the world in positive ways. We want to connect, we want to engage. But when we are chronically made to feel like we don't matter, some of us withdraw. We might become anxious or depressed or turn to substances to try to alleviate that psychic pain of not mattering. Others might lash out in anger. When you think about school shootings, road rage, even political extremes, these are desperate attempts to say, I'll show you I matter. And I do fear that this lack of mattering that is being felt not just in young people today, but also in the adults in their lives. For my second book, Mattering, which is coming out in January, I interviewed adults actually all around the world. I interviewed first responders. I interviewed doctors and nurses in major medical centers. I interviewed parents, caregivers who were sandwiched between caring for young people, caring for aging parents, and having very little room to matter to themselves. And so this next book is really setting up the idea that mattering is a fundamental human need that we are treating culturally as a nice to have. It's not a feeling, it is a human need. And once you see this, now that you sort of hear about mattering, I think it will stay with you. Once you see mattering, it is really, really hard to unsee it. You'll see it in the rudeness on the roads. You'll see it in the workplace when maybe an idea that you have goes unnoticed, or an action that you take is unappreciated. So I want to just kind of summarize, because I want to get into a Q&A with Michaela, but I just want to give you some of the seeds to mattering. Researchers who study it say there are a list of ingredients that go into making young people feel like they matter and the adults in their lives feel like they matter. Things like wanting to feel significant, We all want to feel uniquely known and seen for who we are. How does that show up in everyday life? Knowing my name, remembering something about me that I told you a week or so ago and bringing it up again. So feeling like you are uniquely known. Another way of making a young person or an adult feel like they matter is appreciating them. But there are ways of appreciating someone that can build up a sense of mattering. And the way I talk about it is that it's appreciating the doer, not just the deed, right? So we might have a young person in our care who did an extraordinary job, getting a group to help on a project. You might say to the young person, thank you for your help in leading this workshop or leading what we're doing. But a better way, another way of sort of unlocking and feeding that need to matter, you might instead say, thank you for always being the person that I know I can count on here. Someone I know who is going to be so constructive and bring people together. You are such a marvelous leader. So helping kids get a sense of self, appreciating them for being that kind of a person rather than just the deed itself. Another way we make young people or adults feel like they matter is if we are invested in them. Researchers actually have a very interesting term for this, mattering researchers. They call it ego extension, which is a fancy way of saying that when we extend our own egos to include the egos of others, like the young people in our care, we signal to them that their joys are our joys. Their setbacks feel like pain to us as well. So ego extension is this idea that I am so invested in you and invested in your well-being that it impacts my well-being too. And then the final ingredient I'll give you for mattering is the idea that you are dependent on. So it's one thing to make young people, or again, adults, feel valued. That's very important, right? To feel significant, to feel known. But it is just as important to rely on young people to add value back, to their peers, to the organization, to their community. We feel like we matter when we know we are adding value to the world. That's how we get what I call social proof that we matter. We can hear it in words, but we need to see in action how our lives are positively contributing to the people around us. So while my first book talked about this high achieving culture of young people, and what I found was that they were missing this critical component of feeling like they mattered. They felt like their mattering was contingent on their performance. What I have found is, according to the research, that mattering is a need that is going unmet for so many people today. And I argue it is at the root of our loneliness epidemic, the anxiety and depression so many people are feeling today, the burnout. I have a chapter in my new book for nonprofit leaders, for first responders, for medical professionals, for educators. I call it mattering too much, where you know you are needed and depended on, but your own needs as a person are never prioritized. And that is not true mattering. So anyway, I hope that this was a helpful, really brief summary of the idea of how important it is for the young people in our care to feel like they matter, and how important it is for our colleagues, for the adults in these young people's lives, and for ourselves as first responders to so many young people, that we take action to bolster our own sense of mattering, because our children's resilience rests on our resilience. So anyway, I'm going to close it up here. And I'm going to, if Michaela wants to come up on camera, I'd love to go a little deeper into your new book and to ask you a few questions. And anyone who has questions, please put them in the chat and I'll be sure to ask them as well. So my first question for you is, your book challenges adults to listen more closely to young people. From your conversations and research, what do we most often get wrong about what kids say they need versus what we assume they need?
I think I feel like I'm so stimulated by just what you have just shared about mattering. And I think if I were to go back and write this book again or to do some of the analysis again, I would be thinking more deeply about how mattering plays out in the notion of thriving.
Mhm.
I think, I'm not the first person to say this, but I think that there is a kind of a implicit assumption that young people don't know how to thrive, or they don't know what that looks like, or that we have to somehow foster that desire in them, to want to work, for example, especially when you think about some of the narratives we have about the younger generation, the generations coming up, about them being entitled, about they don't know how to work, all of these things, right? I think that probably, and I think about day-to-day culture, I would say that's one of the most um, clear things that I can see, is that we have this notion that we have to teach them what to want, essentially. And young people actually have, from our research, have a very clear sense of what they want to feel, what they desire to feel as adults. And we need to validate those things. Like, we need to validate that those are real things, that those are valuable things, that those are honorable things, right, to want. And then perhaps to start there rather than a deficit frame, that we have
Yeah,
to teach them what to want and then basically construct an entire path for them.
amazing. Okay, I have another question for you here. Um,
Sure.
Many of the young people you spoke with said, quote, "It's all up to me," which speaks to the powerful pull of individualism in our culture. And I found this as well in my research for both Never Enough and my new book on mattering, this hyper individualistic culture that we are living through today. Yet, young people also recognize how much they need others to thrive. So, how do you see them navigating that tension between self reliance and interdependence? And what can we adults do to support that balance, especially when we don't necessarily model it ourselves?
So exactly. So I think I'll start with the first part. I think that one of the, maybe it's a wrinkle, I don't know, but one of the things about the "it's all up to me" idea, and I think this is, I didn't talk about this, just a few minutes ago, but "it's all up to me" shows up in a couple of different ways. One is in the, I am proud of my decision making because it's all up to me. I feel a deep sense of pride in my ability to make choices for myself. Right? It's like, I did this. Right? The other way that it shows up is pressure, right? It's all up to me. No one can help. I have to make, in particular, premature decisions about my entire life pathway because the adults around me are telling me that the stakes are too high. So often, what we find is that young people, in whatever, I think about it in terms of groups, Black and Hispanic young people, low income young people, but I'm struck by the pressures of the groups of young people that you studied as well. The notion that everything is riding on this moment, and this moment is 17 years old, 18 years old, 19 years old, and that intense pressure to, in my mind, prematurely decide what path you'll take and what you'll do and how your life will look, right? That's the other kind of way that "it's all up to me" shows up.
Mm,
And yes, I think this is very much an output or an outcome of our American culture and our sort of broader narratives around individualism and merit.
mm,
And as you said, I think separately from that, I think it's interesting. We've actually done a really good job of messaging about the idea of social capital or networking, right? That you need other people. Kids will parrot that back to you, right? Like, it's not what you know, it's who you know, right? Everybody it's fully saturated, right? We know that's why LinkedIn exists, right? We all know that we need to have a network of people. You need to meet some people. You need to get, like, whether it's mentoring, et cetera, right? Very much aware that they need those things, right?
mhm.
Very confused about how to get in touch with those people. How do you create those relationships? How do you find those people, et cetera? So again, I think it's about starting with what they know, right? They know they need the people. They may not know exactly which people can help, right? But they know they need the people. So the value or the narrative, self-narrative around needing support is there for a lot of young people. They're aware that they will need some support. I think the terror that that support won't be available, or that you don't know where to find it, or that people won't follow through on what they say they're going to do for you, or that you're not deserving of getting support, or that if you're smart, you won't need support, right? Those are the types of things that I think adults need to engage with. I think the last thing I'll say there is, and this connects a little bit to some of the work that I do with the Gates Foundation around math, is that we as adults are responsible for designing these domains in which young people live and exist, whether that's school or home or out of school, et cetera. And I think one of the things that we fail to do often is that we don't tell complicated stories about our own lives and our own paths. We tell these very neat stories that are neat and clear in hindsight. So when we look back, there's a very clear thread about how I got to be here in this moment, standing here on this webinar with all of you. But the reality is, when I was living it, it was not clear. It was not linear. I did not see that this particular goal, right, or milestone in my path. And I think that young people need to know that when you look ahead from at age 17 or 18 or 19 or 20 or 25 or 27, right, that when you look ahead, what you see may be quite a windy path, or you might see a dead end, or it might be really super foggy and hazy, right? Right? And that we need to normalize that as an experience, as a life experience, in service of, I think, being more realistic with them and more honest with them about what it takes and what it feels like to grow up.
I think that is such a valid point. I have tried in researching my books, I have picked up on the importance of living my life out loud with my kids. I mean, developmentally appropriately, but you know, owning my mistakes, talking about them, talking about when I need to reach out for support when something is hard for me. We've adopted in my own home, what's his name? Ned Hallowell, who's a psychiatrist. He has this phrase, never worry alone, which is something that I have adopted and what I try to model for my kids and what I try to say to the young people that I talk to, that if we never worry alone, we will suffer so much less. There is a question in the chat here about how spirituality can play a role in the concept of mattering. I'm so glad you raised that. So I'm going to back up a little bit in answering this, and I want to explain to you what researchers say mattering is a meta need or an umbrella term. And under it is things like, so all of these other needs, like a spirituality, like purpose and meaning and connection and mastery and self-determination and belonging, all fit under the umbrella of mattering. So the way I've come to think about mattering is that it's really a secular way of talking about spirituality. Our country is, I think it is starting to shift according to the data. People are becoming more spiritual, but it still has a negative connotation, even spirituality. People often equate with religion. And so for me, in my mind, mattering does display so many of the wonderful things that spirituality offer us in terms of benefits. The idea that we belong to something bigger than ourselves. The idea of inherent worth, the idea, you know, that we are, you know, when you think about belonging, I'll leave it here because this has been so impactful, thinking about belonging and purpose and how it relates to mattering. Belonging is important, right? You want to feel like you belong, but you can belong to a classroom or a club or even a family and not feel like you matter to that family, to that club, to that classroom. Mattering takes it deeper. It's saying, I feel valued, which is what you get with belonging, but also that I am dependent on to add value. I make a positive impact. So when you think about your work on belonging, I want you to challenge yourself to think of it in terms of mattering. Put a lens on it, because the mattering lens just takes this work even deeper. You can have a strong sense of purpose, but you can burn out if you are never connected to your impact, if you are adding value into what feels like a void. Eventually, you will disengage. I saw this with firefighters that I interviewed. I don't know if you know this, Michaela, because I didn't, but firefighters are often the first to arrive at the scene of a medical incident or a car wreck. They do their magic, they do their work, and then EMS comes and takes the person to the hospital. But firefighters never know what happens next. Did their efforts make a difference? And so this can cause burnout. Anyway, so it's important. Going back quickly to spirituality, I see mattering as a secular way of talking about spirituality for people maybe who are reluctant to consider spirituality an important part of their lives. Okay.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
So when one of the things that's interesting to me is that the idea of belonging has a lot of traction in youth development and education. So there's lots of models for what it looks like to do that work or try to do that work, increase that kind of feeling for young people. And when I think about mattering, and I think about the reciprocity, and I think about the feeling that you were also contributing, I think about time. One, I think about time to do that, and then I think about how would we adapt some of the interventions and programs that we know exist already, thinking about belonging, into how would we change those to be more about mattering?
Yeah, so I'll give you just a simple formula that I've made up in my own mind about that adding value component. I think of adding value as finding a genuine need. Could be in your family, it could be at the center where you're spending your after school activities, or in your classroom, finding a need, plus adding your time, talent, or resources to meet it. These do not have to be big needs. These can be small needs, but finding them, teaching kids how to take their self-focused lens and turning it outward. So how do we help people find genuine needs? We talk about genuine needs in the community where they're finding themselves. And then helping them match their talent or their time or their treasure, is the way I call it in my book, to meet that need. These do not have to be huge undertakings. It could be your next door neighbor who's elderly. Wouldn't it be nice to once a week bring her, homemade soup, or stop by and visit her? Or if you live in a house and the newspaper is delivered to that man or woman who's elderly, dropping it off at her doorstep instead of making her go down the stairs to get it. There are small, everyday ways that we can add value. Even here's a super easy way to add value, is by telling someone in your life why they matter to you. So the fastest way to feel like you matter is to unlock it in someone else. To me, that is meeting a need, because we have a human need to matter. It takes 10 seconds to feel like you matter. That's it, 10 seconds. Thank you for always greeting me with a smile. Today was so hard, but knowing I was going to see you, you always brighten my day. That is how we can matter. Small, small moments like that. It just takes a noticing and teaching our young people how to locate those needs. All right, back to your book.
Well, some of that happened really organically with young people in the focus groups, actually, and it was kind of like a unintended byproduct, unintended outcome, right, of having these young people who were strangers to each other, and having a single adult in the room, and the adult was the moderator, in some cases me. And one of the things that we noticed actually was exactly what you've described, which is there was something really both beautiful and, I have to say, startling, like the first time that I kind of saw it, that young people who were struggling themselves to figure stuff out, really grappling with some of these questions about the choices they were making, or how to make choices, or what choices, what existed, what resources were there, etc. That they were able to be very vulnerable with what they needed and what their questions were, and in part they were able to, I think my hypothesis is, part of what enabled that vulnerability was two things. One is that the adult in the room wasn't there to provide guidance or to judge them. I wasn't there to jump in and solve the problem or tell them that they need to do X, Y, and Z. And also that they were able to be experts in the room as well. So like during the time, experts is that idea of contribution. During the time that they had these conversations with other young people, there were moments in time where they were the ones that knew something and were able to share that with the group. And there were other moments in time where they were receiving some information and were able to sort of take that in and discuss it with their peers. And we found that as they were walking out, right, this is after they're no longer on camera, you just kind of hear the audio as they're walking out of the room. And what we heard was exchanging Instagram handles, was like trying to take the picture I showed you of the pathway with them, wanted to take pictures of the pathway and telling each other, I'm going to hold you accountable to this thing that you've talked about for 2 hours together, right? And so again, I keep thinking about, yeah, we see that. We see from a
Invested in.
peer-to-peer, right? They're invested in each other's lives. They're invested in each other's stories. And I think, again, in somewhere like the fire, when I'm thinking about what you just said about firefighters, like they want to see how it plays out, right? They want to see how the story goes. Yeah.
People want to know that they matter.
Yeah.
People want to know.
Yeah.
And for a variety of reasons, whether it's the hyper individualism that you have looked at and I have looked at, or if it's that we're just too busy, we have so much input and so much output demanded of us, whether we're a young person or a grown-up, that we live in a world that doesn't often allow us to have those moments like the 2-hour conversation to be able to go deep with someone. I mean, that's an unbelievable experience for a young person to have. We don't really have those experiences anymore.
No.
There's too much input that we have to put in them and then too much output. You were talking about not having adults in the room. And it struck me about another question that I had for you on your book, that you write that young people want to feel that their relationship with adults isn't one way, that adults also benefit from those connections. So I want to ask you, because this again is that ego extension, is that investment in that mattering. How can teachers, mentors, and parents or caregivers communicate that the relationship is meaningful for them as well?
Yeah, I mean, so what I didn't mention when I talked about the research, right, there's 4,000 young people across the country, but we also did interviews and focus groups and surveys with adults, with parents, and with, we call them adult influencers. So they were faith leaders, they were coaches, they were librarians, in some cases after school folks, et cetera. And it was through an analysis of all of those people that we sort of arrived at this kind of realization that there's this mutuality sort of thing that is really important for young people that adults don't always acknowledge, right? Or don't always see. And so I think what you end up with is this kind of vertical interpretation. And this is akin to how we think about education, right? You're kind of depositing some information into a young person coming from, right? It's not, we don't think about it as this kind of engaged, it changes as the young person changes, et cetera, right? We may think about it that way, but that's not what our system is doing, right? So I think I think about it as a vertical, right? A kind of vertical relationship. An adult is standing above you essentially and is like, I'm going to help you and I'm going to deliver or provide you with my insights and my expertise, and then you will take that with you, right? So a couple of things stand out to me. Psychologically, that's a need. As you get older in your life and career, you have a psychological need, a human need to share what you know with other people. And so when we talk about mattering, that is one of the ways that older adults matter. It's one of the ways that we stay healthy in our lives, right? Psychologically and from a brain development perspective, there is this need to share. I think we discount. Right, exactly. And I think the thing that we sometimes discount or discredit is that young people have things to share too. And not only do they have things to share, but as there's a young, an associate at the Center for Rising Generations who talks about the intersection of wisdom and imagination. And I think we don't talk enough about that intersection. And when I think about what is it that I would hope that these relationships between older adults that have some wisdom to share, is that they are engaging with young people's own intelligences and own imagination and giving equal weight to what the value of those things, right, in the world at this time. And the last thing, I think I think you were asking, like, how do we design for that essentially, right? And I think there's two things. I actually think that part of it is about young people talking to each other. I think that there is something very important and powerful about young people feeling that they're equipped to engage with people that are their own age across differences. I think that's especially at this moment in time. I think we need that more than almost anything, right? And then I think there's this intergenerational place. So I think that where you are able and where we are all able, we should be working towards developing and designing intergenerational spaces where young people and adults can talk together in ways that allow their own unique intelligences and wisdom and imaginations to contribute to our world building and our problem solving and our visioning for where we're going to go next. And the last thing I'll say on that point, I also think that we often in the moment there have been several experiences that I've had where we have tried to build spaces like this and we have not prepared adults to participate in the way that they need to in order to be able to really engage with young people as their full selves. And so I want to put that out there because it's both about adults being prepared and also building the spaces in which this can happen.
Oh, great. Well, unfortunately, I could talk with you another 2 hours, but we are now running up against our time. So I'm going to have Melissa take over. But I do want to say, if anyone wants to hear more about Mattering, head over to my website. You could sign up for my newsletter. It's going to be going from monthly to weekly now, or my Instagram. I'm always posting about Mattering, and come join the Mattering movement. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you both so much for making time today to speak with Next City's audience. I love that there's been mention of kind of what adults need to do and build, and we're an outlet that focuses on city planners. And I love that these two worlds are intersecting because it's not just the emotional, it's also the place-based aspect of it as well, to create space and time for belonging and mattering for young people. Again, thank you so much for being here today. If you do want to watch this webinar again or share it with a colleague, you can go ahead and head to nextcity.org/webinars. By Monday at the latest, a recording of this webinar will be up. Additionally, there are links in the chat where you can purchase both Michaela and Jennifer's books. So yeah, definitely stick around in the chat for a bit. We're not going to close the room automatically, but thank you everyone for tuning in today and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.